We're going to take a journey through time to a land of pharaohs, pyramids, and plenty of politics. Today we're talking about Egypt and the many ways its physical geography has affected its history from the earliest settlements along the Nile River in the Neolithic period all the way to modern day. But before we get into it, let's get some of our terminology straight. When people talk about ancient Egypt, they're talking about the civilization that existed here before Greece and Rome were in their prime. Ancient Egyptian civilization lasted for over 3,000 years, from around 3100 BCE, when Upper and Lower Egypt first unified, until around 30 BCE, when Egypt was incorporated into the Roman Empire. The region has been ruled by many different groups since then, including Arab conquerors from the 7th century CE, the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century, and the British Empire in the 19th century. And today it's an independent republic. So if you're thinking ancient Egypt still exists, well, you're not wrong, but it doesn't look or function the same way. Anyway, let's go back to the beginning. Ancient Egypt began along the Nile River, where people settled in small villages and grew crops. In the fertile land made possible by the river's annual floods, these early Egyptians were some of the first people in the world to farm and raise livestock. They also developed some of the first technologies like the plow, irrigation systems, and eventually hieroglyphic writing. As more and more people moved to this region, the small villages grew into larger settlements and eventually 3 distinct regions: Upper Egypt in the south, Middle Egypt in the middle, and Lower Egypt in the north. Each region had its own capital, but in around 3100 BCE, a king from North Egypt conquered the other 2 regions and established the first dynasty of the Egyptian Empire. From there, Egypt became a powerful empire ruling over the Levant, Nubia, and the Sinai Peninsula at its greatest extent. The rulers of Egypt, the Pharaohs, were considered divine and held absolute power. They commanded the loyalty of Egypt's society, which was divided into 3, the elite class who advised the pharaoh and owned most of the land, the middle class of scribes, merchants, and artisans, and the working class of farmers and laborers. Ancient Egyptian society was also heavily influenced by their religion, which revolved around the pharaoh and the idea of the afterlife. In fact, much of their monumental architecture, like the Great Pyramid of Giza, was built as tombs for pharaohs. Eventually, outside invaders from places like Nubia and the Levant took control of Egypt and ruled as pharaohs themselves. But no matter who was in power, the physical geography of Egypt remained constant. The fertile land along the Nile was ringed by deserts, which protected Egypt from outside invaders. To this day, Egypt is located in the same place, and although the desert around it has expanded, the Nile River is still the center of life in the country. In fact, over 95% of Egyptians live within just a few miles of the river. The flooding of the Nile also remained a constant. Every year, the river would flood and deposit nutrient-rich silt on the land, which made it extra fertile. This cycle continued until the 1960s, when the Aswan High Dam was constructed to regulate the flooding. The dam did help prevent destructive floods, but it also disrupted the natural cycle that had sustained Egyptian agriculture for thousands of years. Without the annual flooding, the soil became less fertile, and Egypt had to rely on chemical fertilizers to grow crops. Another way that the Nile has affected Egypt throughout history is through its relationship with the Mediterranean Sea. The river naturally empties into the sea, but because the sea level has risen and fallen over the past couple thousand years, the Egyptian coastline has changed dramatically. In the past, the Nile flowed directly into the sea, but today, the river's delta extends about 200 kilometers into the Mediterranean. The delta is highly productive, fertile land, due to silt from the Nile, and this has made it one of the most densely populated regions in Egypt. The relationship between the Nile and the Mediterranean has also given Egypt access to international trade routes. This has connected Egypt to the rest of the world since ancient times. But because Egypt is such a narrow country, it's always been vulnerable to outside invasion. In the 600s CE, Arab conquerors from the Middle East invaded Egypt, and over the next few centuries, The majority of Egyptians converted to Islam. Egypt became part of the Ottoman Empire in the 1500s, but by the 1700s, it was controlled by the Mamluk military state. In the early 1800s, Napoleon invaded Egypt, but he was defeated by British and Ottoman forces. Still, this started the British interest in controlling Egypt. And after the Suez Canal opened in 1869, Britain occupied Egypt and turned it into a British protectorate. In 1914, World War I began, and Egypt was caught in the middle. Although they sided with the British, many Egyptians were not happy about it. Tensions rose, and in 1919, Egyptians protested British control. It took 2 years of fighting, but eventually Egypt won its independence from the British rule. Since then, Egypt has become a republic. But the country has faced many challenges, from a rapidly growing population to economic instability and political upheaval. Today, the physical geography of Egypt, with its unifying river, protective deserts, and Mediterranean coastline is still the same, but the human geography has changed a lot. We'll continue to explore how human migration and movement have shaped Egypt, and how Egypt has shaped the world in Part 2. Many maps and borders represent modern geopolitical divisions that have often been decided without the consultation, permission, or recognition of the land's original inhabitants. Many geographical place names also don't reflect the indigenous or aboriginal people's languages. So we at Crash Course want to acknowledge these people's traditional and ongoing relationship with that land and all the physical and human geographical elements of it. We encourage you to learn about the history of the place you call home through resources like Native Land CA and by engaging with your local indigenous and aboriginal nations through the websites and resources they provide. Thanks for watching this episode, which was filmed at a studio and was made in partnership with a digital studio and nature. You want to help keep Crash Course free for everyone forever? You can join our community on a crowdfunding platform.